Turning Red is a comedic animated fantasy produced by Pixar and distributed by Disney. The film centers around Mei, a 13-year-old Chinese Canadian who transforms into a red panda. The film is a cute and funny allegory for womanhood, and takes place in 2002 Canada. Aside from the film being set roughly a year after the events of September 11, 2001, the film has nothing to do with the political climate of the era. Hence, Turning Red does not address 9/11, and doesn't need to since it's not an important aspect of the story being told. To criticize the film for not bringing up the tragic events of 9/11 in an animated Disney film aimed at kids no less would be ridiculous. So, somebody brought it up. Enter the mysterious Mr. Enter, a YouTuber who reviews cartoons. He's the type of YouTuber whose bread and butter is to get ridiculously enraged at a cartoon, where their only real insight is how many synonyms and superlatives they can find for the word awful. He gets really performative and childishly irrational, long past the point of either being entertaining or informative. In short, he's the type of YouTuber who grew up on Nostalgia Critic and just never grew up. So Mr. Enter reviewed Turning Red, and he became the talk of the internet for a day for saying this.
This film takes place less than a year after the September 11th terrorist attacks. I bring this up because it radically altered the culture of the time, in ways that make this movie feel exceptionally ignorant of the time. Even though, literally, the only reason I can comprehend that this movie is set explicitly in 2002 is because the director grew up in that exact year. Yes, this film takes place in Canada, not the United States, but all over the Western world. Canada, America, the UK, much of Europe. People were paranoid because 9/11 wasn't the only terror attack that had happened. It was the major theme of the decade.
So yeah, that's a bad take, and you probably already know why. Because it's absurd that someone would demand a Disney animated film of comedic fantasy set in 2002 Canada about a coming-of-age allegory for puberty should talk about the September 11th terror attacks. So by now, everybody has goofed on this guy. He was Twitter's jester for a day, and everyone chimed in with how terrible this position was. And why wouldn't they? This is low-hanging fruit that is ripe for memes. Watch, here's how easy it is. Mr. Enter would watch His Girl Friday and say, "This film doesn't feel like the 1940s. How come nobody is talking about World War II?" And yeah, you get the idea. But I'm not making this video just to make more jokes about his lacking interpretation of historical fiction. Mostly because those jokes have been exhausted. What's more concerning to me is the response that Mr. Enter gave to those questioning his video. Ultimately, I think that this is a bigger issue than just him making some silly statement about how a Disney animated film should weave a real-life terrorist attack into its narrative. I poked around to find out a little bit more about Mr. Enter, and I did not like what I found. He got very irrationally heated at a SpongeBob episode, which led to him making this unhinged rant at three writers.
Alright, you three. What's the word I'm looking for? Dipshits? No, that word is too good for you. Assholes? That's not quite right either. F***ers? No. I'm just gonna call you three excuses for humanity until I can find a description that properly suits your crude, idiotic, and juvenile talentless asses. What reality do you three live in? I really want to know. I'm genuinely curious.
It goes on like that for another 30 seconds, so I'll spare you that time. He has a running series of additionally getting angry at My Little Pony and Family Guy. He burns bridges by insulting his former editors. He said quite directly that healthcare isn't a human right, so major red flag there on his views. But on a more sympathetic side, Mr. Enter has been needlessly harassed in the past. He's been cyberstalked, he's been insulted for being autistic, and profiled on the dumpster-fire docs website Kiwi Farms. None of this is acceptable no matter how many times this dude brings up 9/11 in relation to cartoons. This is not an excuse for Mr. Enter's take being bad, but it does better paint a picture of how he responded to the criticisms of his Turning Red review. His response to this criticism was to essentially double down. He's argued that he's had far worse takes than bringing up 9/11 in his Turning Red review, citing his insults toward creators and going on anti-mask rants about COVID-19. So really, he was already in a hole and decided to dig himself deeper. Mr. Enter's ultimate rebuttal to these jokes on social media was that he was taken out of context with his Turning Red review. Rather than explain himself in his many long responses on Twitter, he opted to just declare that nobody understood what he was really saying and should watch his full video instead of the one that was posted on Twitter. And, yeah. Okay, fine, let's be fair here. Let's actually watch his entire video beyond just the 9/11 statement and see how bad it really is. Spoiler alert, it's way worse than just the 9/11 statement.
I'm going to start with what held me back from actually enjoying the movie, and that is May's mother, Ming. I'm going to be dead straight with you. I hated this character so much that I thought I would have to stop watching the movie. Ming is a helicopter parent, the type who controls every little thing about their child's life and are super panicked that a slight deviation from their plan will harm their child. So they create this self-fulfilling prophecy, where they hurt their child so much more than the rest of the world could. Every time that Ming was on screen, I was angry. The two most infamous bits you've probably heard of, when she finds drawings of May's crush and drives her down to the store to show the boy in them what May did. And the other time is when she came down to school unprompted to try and give May menstrual pads without any self-awareness that she was doing it in front of her whole class. There's also a third moment that really struck me, and that's when May goes to Tyler's party, and Ming was so blind to any possible reasons that May might rebel, especially after the first two incidents, that she basically stops May from seeing her friends. Every time Ming was on screen, this was some of the most uncomfortable a Disney Pixar film has ever made me feel.
Okay, so here Mr. Enter misreads Ming, who is clearly the catalyst of May's transformation. If she seems like an aggravating person for belittling May, that's because it was the intent. A movie's character isn't bad if they're stirring up the intended emotions for their archetype. You don't have to like her, because in the eyes of May, she's an opponent of her social life.
So, defenders will rush and say that this behavior is accurate, especially in Asian communities. And there's a kernel of truth to the kernel of truth here. Asian communities are definitely at least stereotypically strict in upbringing. So, pardon my ignorance. Is it realistic to take a child's drawing of a crush, drag her down to a convenience store, and confront the person in said drawing in a store full of people? Especially if you are under the delusion that these things actually happened, despite one of the drawings being the boy as a merman. Is it really realistic to try and directly give menstrual pads to someone and not leave them with a nurse at school? Ming's behavior is too over the top.
Dude, this is an animated comedy. They're, kinda known for exaggeration.
If you want to talk about realism, we need to talk about Encanto. This was a Disney film also about generational trauma, which seems to be the theme of the season. Mirabel's grandmother was guilty of pretty much the same things, being overly controlling, trying to keep her family in the perfect boxes that she imagined for them. Of course, Encanto didn't make me want to smash my computer because it was subtle. You could constantly understand the reasons that Alma was doing the things that she was doing, even if you didn't agree with them. And in the end, you want to see Alma get better, not have her taken away in the back of a police car. This is like trying to redeem Doofenshmirtz's parents and doing it in a realistic way, and have it all heartfelt at the end. This is not a combination that works. Ming doesn't come across as understandably or realistically strict at any point in the movie. She comes across as psychotic.
Okay, so yes, Encanto does have a more subtle reveal with Mirabel's grandmother and her tragic past. But subtlety is not some instant mark of quality. Encanto and Turning Red are different films about a similar theme. Encanto aims to be musical and heartfelt, hence the quiet concealment of the past. Turning Red wants to be a comedy, meaning that Ming's helicopter parenting will be more overt and over the top. She is overly emotional and insecure about her daughter, feelings that are a major part of the film's focus on empathy. Ming overreacts because the bottling of those feelings turns her into more of a monster, thus giving a greater generational issue for May to conquer. Most people who find themselves traumatized by the past don't always act as refined and content as Encanto's abuela. Consider that Mirabel's grandmother has chosen to bury her tragedy in the past. Ming is still in the process of trying to bury her own worries, and that anxiety of keeping the past at bay can make people act irrationally. And this is the very crux of the picture. It's kind of baffling that Mr. Enter can't read this as character development past the mean adult facade.
The movie also overestimates how common cell phone use was among middle schoolers at the time. It wasn't until the mid to late 2000s when cell phones became a common thing in middle schools. Like, unless the family was rich, even the adults at the time would be using beepers.
Beepers, aka pagers, would have been incredibly inconvenient for middle schoolers to use in 2002. Pagers were also quite frequently used in the drug trade of the 1990s, and this prompted a heavy ban on them from schools. Now, I realize this is a bit anecdotal, but I was a teenager in 2002, and while the frequency of my classmates who had cell phones was somewhat low, the prevalence of pagers, even the more affordable two-way models, were incredibly rare. It's also interesting that Mr. Enter takes note of how Polaroid went bankrupt in 2001, but somehow failed to mention that Motorola ceased production of beepers in 2001 as well. More importantly, though, why is this a big deal? Cell phones are only present in the film for a handful of shots and only used as a means of concealed communication. They're present to depict the secrecy of May's operation. Sometimes films have plot holes that don't make as much sense historically, but they better serve the narrative. For example, in Black Widow, the opening prologue is set in 1995. Natasha and Yelena have the TV on in the afternoon that is playing DuckTales. DuckTales was not a part of the Disney afternoons during 1995, as the show's initial run had ended years ago. Initially, this choice bothered me for taking me out of the era, but its inclusion makes sense on a filmmaking level. DuckTales is a show all about kids going on adventures, making it all the more understandable why Natasha and Yelena are keen to go along with their parents when they say they need to take them on an adventure out of the country. It adds more to the story instead of having the girls watch, I don't know, Gargoyles or Bonkers. It's also such a small and insignificant part of the film that only the most nitpicky of 90s kids would pick up on. Most people who are not familiar with Disney afternoons of that era will care about this criticism because it doesn't affect the rest of the film for them. And the same goes for Turning Red. If you're really hung up on the fact that a few kids have era-appropriate cell phones in school in 2002, then you're missing the bigger picture here.
The anime style also feels off due to the time period. While anime did exist in the West, obviously, besides Sailor Moon or Dragon Ball, Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh!, it was pretty niche until like 2005. Then we started getting tricklings of things like Zatch Bell, One Piece, and so on. I mean, anime definitely was there, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't the styling of the time.
Alright. I'm gonna have to whip out my old geezer geek card on this one. Stating that anime wasn't big in North America until 2005 is an objectively false statement. As anyone from my generation will tell you, anime was ridiculously popular in the early 2000s. He mentions that we only had stuff like Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon. But do you know where Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon aired during 2002? They were on Cartoon Network on a block called Toonami. And you know what else aired on Toonami? Like a whole ton of anime. They didn't just have Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon as though those were the slim pickings of anime that the block had to offer. By 2002, Toonami had aired anime like Voltron, Robotech, Ronin Warriors, G-Force, Gundam Wing, Tenchi Muyo, Tenchi Universe, Tenchi in Tokyo, Outlaw Star, The Big O, Card Captors, The Original Gundam, Gundam 8th MS Team, Gundam 0080, G Gundam, Dragon Ball, Hamtaro, Zoids, and Transformers Armada. And keep in mind, that's just up to 2002, as there's way more anime leading up to 2005. One anime he mentions being a bigger hit in 2005, Zatch Bell, also aired on Toonami, so you'd think he would know this. Speaking of Cartoon Network, remember Adult Swim from 2002 and how they aired nothing but anime on Saturday nights? Stuff like Cowboy Bebop, Yu Yu Hakusho, and Inuyasha? Yeah, that was a thing in 2002. Remember Spirited Away, the only anime to ever win an Academy Award for Best Animated Feature? That was a thing in 2002. Around that era, T-Mobile produced commercials that looked very distinctly like anime, considering that they came from an anime studio. The Suncoast Video Store had an entire section devoted to anime beyond just DVDs, like they had merchandise and all sorts of anime stuff. Comic book shops and bookstores in 2002 had anime magazines like Animerica, as well as manga magazines like Animerica Extra and Pulp. Skip to 2003 and films were starting to tap more into anime. Kill Bill Volume 1 has an entire chapter that is all in the style of anime. And The Matrix had an anthology movie of anime side stories, The Animatrix. There were a ton of anime distributors at the time, and I'm not just talking like ADV Films and US Manga Corps, but like Sony and DreamWorks. Like they had their own anime distribution divisions. They were responsible for pushing a lot of less kid-friendly anime into theaters during that time, such as Metropolis and Ghost in the Shell 2. In 2001, I went to the Gundam truck, which was just a big truck of Gundam merch that drove around to Toys R Us locations around the country. And keep in mind, I've only told you the abridged version of how widespread anime was in North America. Anime wasn't just there in 2002, it was everywhere. It would be really helpful if YouTubers born in the 1990s would stop thinking anime became popular in North America when they first discovered it in elementary school. This is not like a minor error. This is a hugely disingenuous interpretation of anime's influence in America. Mr. Enter making this declaration of anime being niche until 2005 is, at best, an ignorant lie, and at its worst, gaslighting his audience on its history. But it's not even that his statement was wrong, it's that it's actually the opposite. By 2005, anime was actually struggling to maintain its foothold in the West. The Suncoast video stores were closing, so anime had a much lesser influence in retail spaces. By 2004, Toonami had moved to Saturday evenings, and started taking anime off of their schedule before they finished airing their complete runs of the dubs. Remember how we brought up Zatch Bell? Fun fact, Zatch Bell never finished its run on Toonami. Anime distributors were dropping like flies soon after 2005. In fact, by the end of the 2000s, the distributors of Genyan, Urban Vision, and Central Park Media were all gone. If you were to ask anyone during the 2000s which half of the decade was better for anime, it would be the early 2000s and absolutely not the late 2000s. And the thing is, even if we were to grant Mr. Enter this point, that anime wasn't a thing until 2005, that still doesn't support his point that the film can't have an anime style. Do you think anime set during feudal Japan can't look like anime because the medium didn't exist yet? Nothing he has said here supports the point that the anime style is invalid. Why does he have to do so many of these mental gymnastics just to say that he doesn't like the anime influence? If you don't like it, just say you don't like the anime influence. Just say it. Spare us this historical gaslighting of pretending you knew about anime in the 2000s. I really don't know why he had to justify going down this route. The mysterious Mr. Enter has 250,000 subscribers, and it's highly likely that most of them are under the age of 35. It is likely that his viewers will just accept such a historical lie at face value. This is mostly speculation, but I'd wager that most people do not watch Mr. Enter specifically because of his insight or even a prompt for insight. They watch him to get outraged at cartoons because it's entertaining, but part of the fun they take from that outrage is that they feel it is correct. And with his Turning Red review, it's just not. Okay, so now we're at the point in the video where he says the 9/11 thing. However, there's another part of this rant that I think is worth pointing out.
I mean, I can understand not wanting everyone to be so fearful, as that goes against the tone that the movie is trying to establish. But then you have very awkward moments if you actually were there and you do actually remember the time period. Like, the moment with Ming, this strange adult standing outside of the school with a box. An adult that no one wants to account for, completely trying to obscure her appearance and getting attention of the kids in the school. In real world 2002, she wouldn't just be confronted by the school security guard. She would be tackled by the police and hauled in.
Yes, Pixar, please place a scene of heightened security and aggressive police response towards an overbearing mother in your fantasy comedy about a giant red panda. After all, how else will I be engrossed in this picture if I don't feel the cold chill of 9/11 paranoia coursing through everyone's mindset in 2002 Canada?
Cartoons were more daring and diverse back then than you probably give them credit for, and definitely more than the industry does today. Not so much with films, but actual on-television animation, yes. It was probably more diverse back then than it is now, even. You want to talk Asian characters animation? American Dragon Jake Long, Life and Time of Juniper Lee, Jackie Chan Adventures, Yume from Code Lyoko, Hi Puffy Yumi.
I love how Mr. Enter acknowledges that theatrical animation doesn't have a lot of Asian leads, but then just diverts the conversation by saying, yeah, well, Jackie Chan Adventures existed once, 20 years ago. As if that is a good argument about why you should downplay any representation that someone might feel if they watch Turning Red.
But if you want to keep giving credit to a mega corporation that stole your values and is trying to sell them back to you, keep on praising every little scrap of things that they will keep removing for an international market.
Because the only color that Disney and these other corporations care about is green.
I am so tired whenever people make this argument. Whenever somebody wants to counter something that is diverse and opens up to a larger crowd, they like to counter by saying, yeah, well, you know, that corporation only did that for money. And it's like, yeah, corporations do a lot of things for money, and they're usually not very genuine about it. And a lot of people who are pandered to understand this. Saying a corporation only went a particular way just so that they can make money is not the kill shot you think it is. The bigger question that you need to ask here is how social trends have changed so that they go to this avenue for money instead of avenues that they went with previously. But Mr. Enter is not going to question that. He just sees a changing of the demographic and likes to highlight how, oh, they only did this for money, even though, yeah, it's a corporation. They do everything for money. All the time. Okay, so let's pull back a bit here and put things in perspective. Mr. Enter's comments on Turning Red are not the worst that I've seen online. There are plenty of racist and xenophobic takes that are floating around and come from far worse people. Mr. Enter is not even the worst cynical reviewer out there. Like, he's really bad, but trust me, there's way worse. The problem is, I think he represents how people like this are not going to change. After Mr. Enter made that SpongeBob video where the writers were targeted, he said the following: "If I ever do something so stupid as this again, please call me out on it." That was back in 2014, and he's again doing something stupid and his fans are calling him out for it. And his response has essentially just been a shrug and a sneer, thinking that everybody is just being irrationally mean to him. Now, when I was looking over Mr. Enter's many videos, I came across a video he did on Autism Speaks. And I actually kind of like this video. He picks apart that terrible short film the organization made which portrays autism as a disease. It's different than his other videos, and it feels way more personal. It didn't feel as performative, and there was a sense of heart and hurt in that video.
Autism Speaks claims to speak for autism, and yet they have no autistic employees or board members with autism. If you don't at least consult people with the condition that you claim to be speaking for, you are at best condescending to them. At worst, you're dehumanizing them.
Now, I'm not willing to go so far as to say that his harassment online has molded the bitter and bullying person that we're making fun of today. I'm also not saying that his frustrating experiences justify his reactions. The dude spends his time on YouTube getting angry at cartoons. He's not immune to criticism or parody. As I stated previously, Mr. Enter has a huge subscriber base. If he has that large of a platform and he's saying ridiculous stuff about how Turning Red should reference 9/11, or spouting inaccuracies such as how anime wasn't a thing until 2005, that just doesn't seem right to leave unchallenged, especially for a younger audience who is not familiar with that era. Because the bigger problem here is that his arguments are made in bad faith. Mr. Enter is not bringing up animated shows like Jackie Chan Adventures as a means of accurate comparison of progressive themes and animation and how those themes should be expanded upon. He's bringing them up so that he can devalue Turning Red on the basis of its choices in characters and social focus. He's not engaging with the text of the film or its current cultural relevancy. He just saw a coming-of-age film with an Asian woman and immediately jumped to his go-to examples from 20 years ago to downplay any representation that one might feel from this film. I am not making this video in hopes that Mr. Enter will watch it and take note of his errors, because in all likelihood he will not watch this. And even if he does, he will not care about the points cited. I'm making this video in hopes of dispelling inaccuracies in his assertions that his audience may unwittingly believe. I watched some of Mr. Enter's other videos and they're Well, they're just not that good or insightful. Aside from a handful of his videos that are just way too toxic, the majority of his content is mostly mundane criticisms of how much he hates cartoons, resorting to all the typical insults and forced anger that is far too performative to be believable. He just doesn't provide much of any insight. And it's all the old bad faith takes that just about everyone should have grown out of by now. That's why this video was not some call out so much as it is an autopsy. I am making this video relatively long after Mr. Enter left the Turning Red discourse. I'm also not worried about this video boosting his popularity because he really hasn't gotten that big of a bump in views since his Turning Red video, and even his subscriber base has kind of plummeted since. That is also why this is my first and last video on the mysterious Mr. Enter, so don't get your hopes up about me talking about him more in the future. My hope with doing this video is that you'll be better able to see the value of a film like Turning Red, and learn to take less heed of cynical, bad faith YouTube reviewers. If you genuinely enjoyed a film like Turning Red, do not let people like Mr. Enter deter your enjoyment. Much of his criticisms are inaccurate, and he does not care about being proven wrong. And if he doesn't care about his own talking points, then neither should you.